Today's topic is inner pilgrimage. And I think pilgrimage is something that affects us all, whether we have the money and the means to travel or not. Sri Ramakrishna said the devotee takes shelter under Vidya Maya. That is the Maya that leads us towards God, and therefore seeks holy company, goes on pilgrimage, and practices discrimination, devotion, and renunciation. This devotee says that, since one cannot easily get rid of the ego, let the rascal remain as the servant of God, the devotee of God. What is the purpose of pilgrimage? Well, first of all, it's to plant and strengthen our spiritual samskaras, our spiritual tendencies, by visiting holy places associated with holy personalities. When I was in India in 1979, Swami Nitya Swarupananda, a disciple of one of the direct disciples of Ramakrishna, heard that I was going to Dakshineshwar, and he told me, memorize every nook and cranny of that place so that you can remember it later in your mind's eye. That made a deep impression upon me, because when I went, I made it a point to do just that. And I found that by really taking in every specific nook and corner, that when I returned to America, that meditation on Ramakrishna's divine Leela strengthened my spiritual life. And all the places associated with meaningful incidents in the lives of Ramakrishna, Sarda Devi, and Swami Vivekananda. For example, the semicircular porch at Dakshineshwar, where Sri Ramakrishna gave Naran his first touch of the non-dual experience. What a wonderful place to visit with that knowledge. Or the veranda at Dakshineshwar, facing Mathur Babu's mansion, where Sri Ramakrishna was pacing to and fro, and Mathur was looking out from his mansion and found that as Ramakrishna approached the mansion, he was Mother Kali, and when he turned, he was the great Lord Shiva. And he wept and ran to touch Sri Ramakrishna's feet and said, I will never doubt you again. The very stones on which Sri Ramakrishna walked give us a sense of purity. Give us a sense, yes, religion is living. It happened right here. And when we go back and meditate on those experiences, it is happening right here in our heart, closer than any physical place on this earth. When we go to Dakshineshwar, we see the Nahbat, where Sarda Devi lived and served Sri Ramakrishna, and where she peeked through the bamboo screen to see the kirtan that was taking place in Ramakrishna's room. And when we go there, we see the proximity that this great, great soul had. And we relive the drama. It was the first time when I went to India that I was reading so much of the descriptions of India, where I saw these ponds. Yes, Bengal was filled with ponds. And the landscape in which Sri Ramakrishna and Sarda Devi and Narendra grew up sharpens the context in which Sri Ramakrishna lived his village life. It makes his life much more vivid, much more immediate. And when I look at the villages and I saw their interactions, I understood. Their simplicity was just jaw-dropping. How they interacted with each other, and it made it much more clear to me how Sri Ramakrishna and why Sri Ramakrishna interacted with his disciples the way he did. They would jump on his back, and I thought, how can a grown man allow such a thing? But when I went to the village, I saw firsthand how it's possible. And in such a simple setting. How the children were naked in their simplicity, smiling. I saw the women husking as they held their children. And I was able to relive some of Sri Ramakrishna's parables, just watching the simple life in the village. And to walk down the lanes of Kamapakor, I could feel the proximity of those places in Kamapakor so closely associated with him. And it brought everything into focus and internalized it. And so when I came home, I felt enriched and strengthened in those memories. So what happens in the mind when we go on pilgrimage? It's an internal pilgrimage. This pilgrimage of the heart is much more vivid, much more alive, much larger than even the physical pilgrimage. We see outside that sparks that internal awakening. It's like a tsunami that destroys destructive past samskaras. It's like a breeze of grace that purifies and transforms our negative thoughts into those that are powerful and positive. It's a holy company. It's a type of holy company. And when we're invited in, we stand and it takes over. This is what St. Paul meant when he said, "Be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind." Pilgrimages help us to renew our mind. There's another form of pilgrimage called sadhu sangha. Places on this earth will always remain, but these great souls will pass away. And with them goes an oral tradition. A darshan from these sadhus is like a darshan of powerful events. And being in their company, we extract a subtle experience that is transmitted to us by being in the presence of holiness. We feel a subtle strength of the vibrations of their life. We feel their spiritual strength of mind that strengthens our own mind. It acts like an osmosis, subtle, penetrating. We're not even aware of how uplifted we feel, how much we have ingested, how deeply we take these impressions into our heart. That is why we have spiritual retreats here. We may come for an hour or two every week, which is good. That strengthens. But when we come for several hours in several consecutive days, that's a powerful influence on our spiritual life. Once I asked Venerable Anandamoy Tre, one of the great Buddhist monks of the Theravada Buddhist tradition. He was in fact the head of the Theravada tradition. At the time I met him, he was in his 90s. And he came to visit us in Santa Barbara, and I had the great good fortune of driving him back to one of his ashramas in Los Angeles. We got stuck in rush hour traffic, and so it was a 2-hour blissful experience of being in the company of the holy. I asked him, what is it when one feels an electric charge, when one is in the presence of a very rare soul? I used to feel that whenever Swami Pravrajika would come to Santa Barbara, the whole property would vibrate with electricity. He said, from then, the Kundalini has become raised. You enter into the orbit of that spiritual power, and something is transmitted, and you feel the benefit. So even if we're not aware that there is an electric charge of vibration, we benefit. Another advantage is purification. How these great souls implant new samskaras into us through their teachings, through their humor, through their scoldings. And this also happens on pilgrimage. I remember when I attended the Durga Puja at Brahmaprana. It's so famous, it's televised throughout India. And I was sitting in the front row because I was a monastic on the women's side. And during the Kumari Puja, I felt this thunder, this roar, coming from the crowd before I ever saw the little Kumari, this little virgin girl of 6 or 8 years old. And as she was brought into the pandal, she was carried on the shoulders of her uncle and her father, and placed on this small, tiny throne and worshipped as a special manifestation of divinity. This special moment of beholding that, to see how the crowd's devotion swelled at the sight of this special moment, the worship of the living Shakti in a tiny little girl. It awakens such a sense of the motherhood of God and her living presence, especially manifest in women, or as we should say, in woman with a capital W. This was Vivekananda's intent when he established the Durga Puja at Bellarmont. Not only to bring in the poor villagers into the gates, within the gates of Bellarmont, for them to feel the value of this revolutionary monasticism, but it was his desire to awaken within India this worship of the Divine Mother in the living woman, a deep-rooted teaching within India. And in fact, in the first Durga Puja, he worshipped, Vivekananda himself worshipped 7 Kumaris as Durga. One sadhu that I always wanted to meet was a brother disciple of my teacher, Swami Pravrajika. His name was Swami Nirvanananda, Suji Maharaj. He was one of the vice presidents of the order. A great soul, I knew, because from my teacher I came to understand that Swami Brahmananda, on his deathbed, turned to Suji Maharaj and said, Suji, you have served me well. I give you the boon of Brahmagyana. Now within our order at that time, there were many disciples of the direct disciples. There were more Brahmagyanis in our order than we could count on our fingers and toes. It was just an incredible experience to be in the presence of these great souls at this particular time in the history of the order. But Swami Nirvanananda, I knew to be a Brahmagyani, and I wanted to see what it was like, what it looked like, what it felt like. My own teacher was a soul of a great order. He himself had experienced samadhi any number of times, but it was God with attributes, or the vision of God. I wanted to see what this great soul, Swami Nirvanananda, looked like, how he taught, what he transmitted. And so we stood in line, Bellarmont. He was in the compound where Swami Vivekananda used to live. It was upstairs, and there was a long queue of devotees. And so we lined up. And Swami Nirvanananda was behind the gate of his room with an attendant, and people would make pranam there, behind in front of the gate. The attendant saw us, and he whispered something into Swami Nirvanananda's ears, and the attendant beckoned us closer. Crowds were stopped, and we were ushered into his room. He could barely speak English. And each of us, there were 3 of us, a sannyasi and 2 brahmacharis, myself being one of the brahmacharis, knelt at his feet, and with each one, he stroked our heads and said, I see God in you. It was such an extraordinary experience Never before in my life had I heard the word I uttered from such a great and profound distance. This I was not the ego. This I was the Atma, the self. And as he stroked each of our heads, tears just rolled from our eyes. This is the power of pilgrimage. But when we go on pilgrimage, we should not expect anything. Sometimes we're shunned. Sometimes we're scolded. Sometimes we're robbed by thieves. Sometimes we hear grievous news of a dear one who's passed away. See? But when we go on pilgrimage, we should prepare our mind that we are going to receive the teaching that is meant for us, because that experience is magnified. And all the more so if we go alone, or if we go in a very small group, because those devotees who go with us, they carry their samskaras, their karmas, with them, with a whole group. But if you go alone, with just a very, very select companion, what happens and opens up on your pilgrimage is meant for you and you alone. It's all the more intense. Let me share with you a pilgrimage of a devotee from Southern California, Usha Hardy. She founded a beautiful Kali Mandir near Laguna Beach. And she imported Dakshineshwar Kali temple priests once a year to perform the Kali Puja there. She has an image and it's worshipped every day. It's a mandir. And there are monks of a different order who stay there with her. And it's surcharged. It's really a place of pilgrimage. And I highly recommend that you try to visit that whenever you come to Southern California. Usha intimated, I started going to the Hollywood Center in the fall of 1970. And although I visited the temple fairly regularly, I kept mostly to myself. But one sunny day in 1972, I saw revered Swami Gombirananda walk across the temple courtyard. And I overheard Swami Chaitananda say to a group of devotees, if you want to get close to a real holy man, you should try to get close to Swami Gombirananda. I met Swami Gombirananda when he was the General Secretary of the Order. He went on to become one of the presidents of the Order. Usha said, I started writing to him regularly at his Bellarmont address. And she said, and right from the start, I never addressed him as Swami in my letters. I always wrote, Dear Father. And mind you, she never introduced herself. She had never met him, formally. And he never corrected me, she said. I wrote to him every 3 months. Without fail, he always replied. At first, his letters were very formal. Swami Gombirananda was the type of sadhu who was very sober. Gombirananda, somber, profound. In the 1980s, Swami Gombirananda's letters got less formal, she said, and he addressed me as my dear Elizabeth. I remember how excited I was to receive his letters, and I would hold his letter, turn it from side to side, and with great relish anticipate the blessings contained within them. He never let me down. I once wrote to him a letter full of despair, and he replied, mark these words, I hope you realize that true peace can only come by surrendering to the divine within us. The world will always go on in its own way. There can never be any permanent solution to problems created by human nature. There can never be any permanent solution to problems created by human nature. Lucia stated, in 1986, I visited India for the first time, and the experience of India was much richer than I had ever anticipated. I met Swami Gambhirananda again in person after so many years, but this time I did not stay back. It was like seeing my dear father again after many, many years. And although my eyes saw him looking stern, my heart felt his by now familiar love. I was not shy and felt free around him like a child feels sitting near her dad. She reminisced every evening I would go to his quarters for darshan, and he would always lovingly ask, "What did you do today?" Then he would patiently listen to all my ramblings about what I did and thought about the day. Now, these reminiscences are so personal, and we can identify with her shyness and how slowly she became close to such a great soul. I returned to India in 1987 and with great joy sat again at revered Swami Gambhiranandaji's feet. He taught me so many things even when he was not directly talking to me. This is how it happens. This is what it's like being in the presence of holiness. I asked Swami Gambhirananda once about seeing Sri Ramakrishna seated in my heart. She said, "Swami, how does Thakur sit in my heart?" See, those of us who meditate, sometimes they come with questions like that. Does he face me? No, he stated. He looks in the same direction you are looking in. In other words, he's facing outward from the heart. And Gambhirananda said this with great conviction. After a while, he added, "But don't think about it so literally. Don't get caught up in the strategic logistics of the Lord, who is infinite and vast, is seated cross-legged in your heart." So Usha said, although I felt I knew Swami Gambhirananda with my heart, I knew little about his personal habits. But I'm very grateful to his attendants, who sometimes explained Swami's actions to me, and that was Swami Ramananda, with whom I came into close contact. Not only was he a personal attendant of Swami Gambhirananda, but he worked on his commentary of the Bhagavad Gita, according to Madhusudananda Saraswati, his translation. One day, Usha said, as I was sitting at his feet, he suddenly reached out and with great precision placed his hand on my head. He held it there for a very long time. I was delighted and took it as a token of affection he extends to all visitors. But later, one of his attendants, Swami Ramananda, most undoubtedly, explained that this moment was truly special because the Swami rarely showed open affection. Gambhira. Swami Gambhirananda, Usha said, knew I was concerned about his health. Swami Gambhirananda was very elderly, and he had many old age ailments. When I pranamed in 1987, about to leave for America, he leaned forward and said, "Don't worry, I will not die. I will wait until you come back." She became very restless in October 1988 and desired very strongly to go to India. And by November, she booked a ticket. And a few days before departing, she bought a video camera. And since there wasn't much time to learn about video cameras, she decided to study the manual on the plane to India. I arrived at Bernard she said, on December 24th, and heard that Swami Gambhirananda was arriving from one of his tours, initiating tours. Maharaj was helped out of the car. I will never forget this scene. One attendant was leading Swami by one hand, while he used his other one to support himself on a cane. He slowly walked past me toward his room. Although his body walked into the opposite direction from where I was sitting, his being came toward me. There was no doubt about it. Attendants then told me that Maharaj was not well and most probably would have to go to the hospital for a checkup. I left his quarters, but on my way back to the guest house where I was staying, a servant told me to go back to President Maharaj's house. I returned and saw a small group of monks standing outside the entrance. I felt shy, she said, and uncertain about what to do. But one attendant saw me and told me that Swami Gambhirananda would see me now. The Swami sat on a chair that looked like a lawn chair with a yellow towel draped over it. When he heard me enter the room, he stood up. To my great surprise, he threw out his arms wide and with a loud voice said, "Welcome, welcome home." I mumbled something about being very happy to see him and that I had bought a video camera and wanted to take snaps of him. He patiently listened to my stammering and after some time softly said, "I shall take rest now." When I bowed to his holy feet, I did not know that these were the last words I was to hear from him while he was alive. Somehow it didn't occur to me that he could die. I was told that he would depart for the hospital soon, so instead of going back to the guest house for my lunch, I walked to the main gate to see his car go by toward the hospital. That was the last glimpse I got of Swami alive. Usha Harding's journey was an inner pilgrimage, one that led her in her grief to be the only person blessed to actually videotape the cremation of a president of the Ramakrishna order. Sri Ramakrishna, Sarada Devi, and Swami Vivekananda, all the direct disciples, went on pilgrimage, but each of their purposes was different. Great souls recharge the holy places where they go with their own spiritual vibration. Even Girish Ghosh, Swami Gautamananda related. Swami Gautamananda is the vice president of the Ramakrishna order. He said it's very easy to meditate upon Sri Ramakrishna for 7-8 hours. This was Girish Ghosh talking. I'm trying to forget him for a minute, and I cannot. So this was Girish Ghosh. He didn't have to meditate on Ramakrishna. He was trying to forget him, and he could not. Once Sri Ramakrishna, early on in Girish's association with Ramakrishna, he asked him to bathe in the Ganges to purify himself, but Girish refused. He said, if I bathed in the Ganges, it will become polluted. He used to say there was no sin I had not committed. But after Ramakrishna died, he bathed every day in the Ganges. Someone once asked, why? And Girish replied, I'm not bathing to wash away my sins. This body is pure. Ramakrishna has taken away all my sins. I'm bathing in the Ganges to purify the Ganges. And this is what happens when great souls go on pilgrimage. My first trip to India, in those days there were no rules that we know of today. As a young brahmachari, my sister and I, we would go to the early Mangala Arati, and then we would meditate there for some time, and then go to the Ganges bank, right there in Bellarmine grounds, and meditate. And as the sun rose, day after day after day, I began to feel a vibration of holiness from this river. I thought, how is it possible that a river could be holy? That was my first experience of such a phenomenon. When Ramakrishna went to Varanasi, he visited each place with a specific mood. He himself said, I expected to find everyone in Varanasi absorbed in samadhi, meditating on Shiva 24 hours a day. Everyone in Vrindavan wild with ecstatic joy in the company of Krishna. But when I went to those places, I found them to be different. Just because someone lives in a holy place does not make them holy. At Deogar, Ramakrishna started the first humanitarian service of the Ramakrishna order. Yes, it wasn't Vivekananda. Vivekananda infused Sri Ramakrishna's life teachings into his doctrine of service of the living God. But it was Sri Ramakrishna who first exemplified or voiced these teachings. He was so moved with compassion to see the poor, he said to Mathur, you are a steward of Mother's estate. Give each of the poor one good cloth and one good meal, and also some oil for their heads. Mathur protested. Could be a little conservative with his money. Some might say even stingy. He said, Father, this pilgrimage will cost too much. Mind you, by today's standard, he was a multi-millionaire. Sri Ramakrishna cried out in anguish, you wretch, I'm not going to Varanasi. I'm staying here with these people. They have no one to care for them. I won't leave them. And so Mathur had to do as Sri Ramakrishna had requested. Ramakrishna visited the holy personality, Trailanga Swami, to see what a Paramahamsa looked like, mind you. A Paramahamsa going to visit a Paramahamsa. He visited the Vishwanath temple almost daily, and he brought back holy relics from his trip, the dust from Vrindavan, which he scattered in the Panchavati. There are 3 material objects in the world: the Ganges water, Jagannath Puri Prasad from the sacred temple of Puri, and the dust from Vrindavan, a particular place in Vrindavan that are considered by Sri Ramakrishna as Brahman in material form. And he scattered this in the Panchavati. Why did Sarada Devi go away on pilgrimage? To overcome her agonizing grief at the Master's passing. And she wanted to visit the places associated with his previous incarnations. She knew Ramakrishna to be Rama, to be Krishna, to be much more. To be God himself. And she had many visions of the Master. And when she went to Vrindavan, Sri Ramakrishna appeared to Sarada Devi and Yogin Ma, her attendant, to assuage their grief and said, here I am. I have just gone from one room to the next, as it were. And it was in Vrindavan that Mother realized her aspect as Sri Radha. She said, I indeed am Radha. Swami Vivekananda, why did he go on pilgrimage? In May 1890, he told Sarada Devi, Mother, if I can become a man in the true sense of the term, then only shall I return to the monastery. Otherwise, this will be my last farewell. When Sri Ramakrishna saw Narendra for the first time, he recognized his disciples' spiritual origins. as Nara, the ancient sage, who had come to earth to take away the suffering and sorrow of human beings. So in Vivekananda's itinerant days in India, he wanted to educate himself about his homeland, and he saw the conditions of the poor, the sick, the illiterate. He saw the pitiful conditions of Indian women who were subjugated by outdated Indian customs of child marriage and widowhood. And he saw India's future. All of this happened in his pilgrimage. He saw India's future to come forth from character-building education, methods to improve agriculture, hospitals to nurse the sick, and social services for orphans and widows, and a mott for women, run by women, the first women's mott in the history of the world religions to be established by Vivekananda's dream. He wanted India's Sanatana Dharma to be reawakened, to inspire India's youth, India's future, to elevate the nation once again. All this was what he received on pilgrimage, and much more. He had many, many spiritual experiences. And he grew in stature as a man with a capital M. And he assumed his rightful heritage as the embodiment of Nara, which means man. And on the eve of his departure for the Parliament of Religions, he met Swami Turiyananda, who was more drawn to contemplative life than to the public work of the Ramakrishna order. And he said to him, "Haribai, I am still unable to understand anything of your so-called religion." And with deep sorrow and intense emotion, he placed his hand on his heart and said, "But my heart has expanded very much, and I have learned to feel. Believe me, I feel intensely indeed." His voice was choked with feeling, and he could say no more. There was a profound silence as the tears rolled down his cheeks. Turiyananda Swami was so overcome and thought to himself, are not these the very words and feelings of Lord Buddha? So this bodhisattva ideal had gained fruition in Vivekananda's heart during his pilgrimage, during his itinerant days. Well, we've talked about what pilgrimage is. Let's talk briefly about what pilgrimage is not. It is not an escape. It's not a fix-all. It's not a getaway. And it's not a last resort. When Naren went to Bodh Gaya, Sri Ramakrishna told the other disciples, "Why are you so anxious?" They thought that he would stay there. He was so in tune with the Buddhist path. He will be back soon. He said, "Travel in all four directions. You will not find spirituality anywhere. Whatever exists is here," he said, pointing to his body. And here means two things. Nowhere is there a greater manifestation of divinity than within the avatar. And second of all, God dwells in every human being, in all of us. And if we can't kindle that love and devotion within ourselves, we cannot achieve any benefit by traveling to various places. Swami Pravrajika taught us that. He wanted to go and live in solitude and practice austerities while the direct disciples were living, while his own master was living, Swami Brahmananda. And at first, Maharaj gave his consent, but he didn't realize how serious his young disciple was. "All right, go to the river Narmada and practice austerities, and let me see what you can do." And so within a few weeks, Swami had packed his bag with his travel arrangements, and then went to Maharaj to receive his blessings. And Maharaj was alarmed. "Where are you going?" Swami said, "You have given me permission to go to the river Narmada to practice austerities. I'm ready to go." And like a father about to lose his son, he anxiously called Swami Shivananda at once, as though he wasn't enough to convince his disciple to stay, and said, "Look, brother, this boy wants to practice austerities. Why do these boys do such things? Why do they have to practice? We've done all that for them. We've done all that for them." Swami Brahmananda said, though temples may serve as aids to the beginner, they are but symbols of God's greatest temple of all temples, the human heart. And Sri Ramakrishna used to say, in such a convincing way, as long as a man feels that God is there, he is ignorant. But he attains knowledge when he feels that God is here. You know, we can masquerade this lack of priorities by spiritual fervor, even with a monastic disciple who hankered to go back to Varanasi. Now, normally you think, well, that's a wonderful desire. But Swami Swahananda said at one point, "Why are you hankering to go and see Vishwanath? The real Vishwanath is in the heart." This erased this devotee's sense of pride in an outer display of spiritual yearning. You see how tricky it can become. Pilgrimage is not sightseeing. And when we try to combine it with too many things, we kind of water down the intensity of pilgrimage. Also, if we try to see too many things at once, we aren't able to grasp what is there in front of us. It takes some time for us to begin to feel the vibration of a holy place. Again, 75% of pilgrimage is internal. Swami Pravrajika once told us, in order to know the spiritual vibration, I would have to sit down and meditate. Shankara could pass by a place and say, a great soul must be living there. But I am not that advanced. I must sit down and calm my mind, but through the grace of my Guru and Mother, I can raise my consciousness whenever I want to. And so, we also must be prepared to exert a little more internal meditation on our pilgrimage in order to read what is there before us. Again, pilgrimage is unpredictable. When a devotee went to pay his respects to Sarada Devi in Jayaramati, he became irritated, that things didn't go just like clockwork. And Mother said, "You must give me freedom. Don't expect the pace of village life to run like clockwork as in Calcutta. You must adjust to village life." And so when we're on pilgrimage, we have to make up our mind to adjust to time, place, and circumstance. And that in itself requires a certain amount of spiritual power. What are the goals of pilgrimage? Well, they vary according to the needs and the capacities of the individual. I would say to be open to whatever and wherever the Lord chooses to reveal himself, herself, itself. We must always be ready. Once, the sister of the donor of the Santa Barbara convent came to stay with us, Doris Kellogg. And she was quite advanced in age. She was beautiful devotee. And she was about 4 foot tall, I swear. And yet she had the stature of a woman, 6 feet. She was very strong in stature. I asked her what her practice was. She said, always to be ready to receive the Lord. Always to be ready. So each day for her was a pilgrimage. And she would first prepare her mind for it in meditation. There was another devotee who had a very troubled childhood and married into a great wealth, which turned her head. She became very arrogant and critical of others. She was a good devotee. She meditated regularly, but these samskaras are hard to change. They're hard to see, first of all. It's very hard for us to see ourselves. She herself had been very vulnerable, poor, and indigent. And so she mocked and disparaged people who had less than her. When she was standing in line at the grocery store and there was a dumpy old woman who was standing in front of her, sort of like a bad lady. And this devotee, she was beginning to criticize this woman in her mind. Suddenly the woman turned around and this devotee saw Mother Kali. We never know. We must always be ready. Pilgrimage is spiritual practice. It's an intense purification. And as I said, we can receive this purification by the vibrations of the holy sadhus we meet, the holy places where we live and dwell for some time, but also what we receive from scoldings and from hardship. Once at a special holy day of celebration, a very, very intimate and wonderful devotee was injured on the premises of the Portland ashram at the time of Swami Asheshananda. Swami Asheshananda turned to me and she had to have stitches. It was such a severe injury, she had to go to the hospital for stitches. He turned to me and said, why do these things happen? More karmas are erased at such times. You see, we cannot judge. We cannot judge what happens to us. But this much we know, that a pilgrimage intensifies our spiritual practice. We receive inspiration and visions sometimes. Yes, they can happen. At Kalighat, one devotee who never was prone to experiences intimated to me later, after her pilgrimage, at Kalighat, which is a very primordial aspect of Mother Kali, I felt a mother saw the contents of my mind. It's an experience. Sometimes experiences come after pilgrimage, and that is why our teachers tell us, go on pilgrimage and then come home and chew the cud. Relive your experience. Some of those experiences that happened in the 70s, I'm still reliving. Still chewing on them and deriving greater meaning. Also what happens is a greater dependence on the Lord, a surrender. This is no small thing. It is spiritual strength. Jyoti Rupananda, the head of the Russian centers for work in Russia, he harbored a desire to leave for a 2 years pilgrimage. And one day he vanished. Other monks complained to Swami Shankarananda that he left without permission. But Swami Shankarananda knew his young monk and said, my disciple has left on pilgrimage. End of story. What happened in pilgrimage? Well, Jyoti Rupananda went with another Swami who I had the privilege of meeting at Swami Shiva Mayananda. He explained that devotees don't necessarily give alms in South India. And so at that time, especially at that time, this was in the 50s, he starved. Both of them starved. And they finally came to a dumpster, and there was just a rotten onion inside the dumpster. And they shared it, and they were sick for days afterwards. These were some of the rigors of their pilgrimage. Those of us who leave and we plot out our pilgrimage with, oh, I'm going to be staying here, and how much donation do I leave at this? For those pilgrims who went on pilgrimage without any accommodation, tremendous strength. And that was the strength that allowed his close brother monk who accompanied him to stand up to very frightening circumstances. As I've shared with you before, in the 1970s, the best of Bengal was rounded up by police, shot, and their bodies were dumped in the Ganges, the Naxalites. And in the middle of the night, police entered Vidyapit, one of our schools, and took him away. And Shiva Moyananda was awakened, and he ran to the Ganges and saw the boy surrounded by 3 policemen, guns pointed to his head. And he ran up and hugged the boy and said, "You have to shoot me first." And the police were so startled by such bravery, they turned and fled. Spiritual strength that comes from pilgrimage. A solitude and silence that comes from pilgrimage. Remember how Vivekananda went on pilgrimage to leave his brother disciples. He wanted them to stand on their own feet. He went by himself to gain spiritual insight, to awaken a wisdom heart. I visited the Kasar Devi temple where he went, the local presiding deity of Almora, right behind the Saradamat on the hill. And it was a forest where he wandered through huge boulders and trees. And he came to the hilltop cave to behold the presence of Kasar Devi. He entered and sat in meditation and became so absorbed that he began to merge in the absolute. And then and there he yearned to drop his body. But suddenly from within, as it were, someone began pounding on his chest. "No, get up, you must work." And so Vivekananda obeyed the command from his master and returned to consciousness to fulfill his preordained mission on earth. So this is an inner and outer pilgrimage of the mind. It's a spiritual practice and a practice of renewing our mind. Once when I came back from Assisi, an incredible loka, Christ loka, where St. Francis of Assisi lived, I brought with me photos and a rosary from the caves where St. Francis had practiced meditation. And I knew that Swami Bhajanananda, an assistant secretary of the order, was very, very devoted to St. Francis. He teaches comparative religions at the training center. And so I came with these from my pilgrimage. He thanked me. But he said, "I don't need to see photos of Assisi. I have studied the maps and photos, and I have visited there in my meditation. I have no need, no desire to go there." Sister Devi Mata, who associated very closely with Swami Ramakrishnananda, wrote in her diary, which became Days of an Indian Monastery, an atmosphere of holiness, of aloneness, enveloped Swami Ramakrishnananda. It was not created by lack of companionship. His intervals of solitude were few, except for those he stole from his sleep at early dawn or in the quiet hours of the night. There was a constant coming and going in the monastery hall where he sat. This was in Madras. Rare were the solitary moments in the day, yet the Swami seemed alone. One day I made a passing reference to it, and his decisive reply was, "I am full of God. What need have I of anyone else?" Aloneness means singleness. When there are two, there is always fear. We think we need a companion to protect us. If we have to go out on a dark night, or if we have to enter an unlighted house, we want another person with us. In reality, fearlessness exists only when we are alone. When we are alone, we can dance or sing or make faces, do whatever we like. But let a friend come and at once we begin to be careful about what we do. There comes a sense of restraint, a sense of constraint. We grow self-conscious. Fear exists when there is duality. Fearlessness exists when there is only one. Since we cannot be happy so long as we fear, we shall not be able to find peace until we can say, "I am alone, I need nothing." So pilgrimage brings us great spiritual benefit. It spiritually recharges our meditation. I had the blessed fortune, we in our Santa Barbara convent, we used to meditate. It was towards the end of it, well, throughout his life. But when he could no longer go to the little shrine and had to meditate in his room, we would go there every morning and meditate with him. And he later shared with us that his preliminary practices of meditation was to revisit the holy places where he had received some spiritual experiences. Those places that were most meaningful in India to him. Sri Ramakrishna says, "As cows after eating their fill of water lie quietly down at a place and chew the cud, so after visiting a holy spot or a place of pilgrimage, you must take hold of the holy thoughts that rise in the mind there. Sit down in a solitary spot and think of them till you become immersed in them."